L'Shana Tova. So I am not particularly proud of this story, but it does give you an idea of who I am and why I love Judaism. So when I was a rabbinical student at the University of Judaism, now it's called the American Jewish University, we lived in the slums of Beverly Hills, right off of Wilshire. And we lived about 3 doors down from a Porsche Audi dealership, which was on the corner of Hamilton, R Street, and Wilshire. Given that it was a Porsche Audi dealership, they went on test drives with Porsches and Audis. And one of the attractions of Porsches and Audis, for those of you who might not know, is that they go fast. So when we moved to Hamilton, we had Tehila, who was 4, and Rena had just been born. So this was already a couple of years into it, so they were probably 6 and 2, 7 and 3, something like that when this happened. The first several times that the cars went, in my opinion, dangerously fast on my street when my kids were out playing with me, I was very respectful, and I went to the manager and I said, "Hi, my name is Dr. Cherry. I'm a rabbinical student, and I've got a couple of kids on the street, and I've noticed blah, 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 blah." And I noticed also that that did not have much of an impact on their salesman, or how their salesman would test drive on the street, or how their salesman would allow their potential customers to test drive on the street. So I decided that I would, try a more direct approach. So actually, Rena was baby Bjorned into me. So this she must have been less than 1 year old. And I asked to speak to the manager. The secretary said, "Oh, I'm sorry, they're having a meeting right now. Can I help you?" And I said, no, thank you. And I proceeded to go to the door and open up the door. Okay, I flung open the door and I slammed my fists down hard on the desk of the manager with whom I had spoken before. And I said, "I want you to be absolutely clear that if you don't rein in the speed of your cars as they test drive on my street when my children are playing, I will cost you money." Okay, it was dramatic. So Rambam says that it's fine to act mad as long as you're not really mad, because it's that kind of dramatic impact that might move some people who need drama as opposed to reason. And I had gone the reason route, and that clearly was not working. So I left. And then it happened again. I was outside. It was actually on Shabbos, playing with the kids. Rebecca was at work. And I thought, okay, so far what I've done has not been effective. So I worked myself up to be very dramatic. I hadn't quite figured out how I was going to manifest the drama at that point. But they had kind of really zoomed up my street. There was a couple, I don't know, in their 50s or 60s, probably in their 60s, and a salesman driving a Porsche convertible. And so they went up the street. So I started marching the couple of houses to confront the Porsche Audi dealership. And as I was going into their driveway, that car was coming back into the driveway. And so as it passed me, I jumped. I took a leap onto its bumper, jumped into the cab because it was a convertible, and I started screaming and waving my hands like a madman, saying that you're going to kill my children, you're going to kill my children, I'm going to, I was very dramatic. And there was the threat of a restraining order. But my point of telling the story is that for the rest of the 2.5 years that we lived there, it never happened again. The dealership understood that they've got this man on their block who is just kind of, I don't know, protective of his family. And he might do really unhelpful things for business if we antagonize him again by doing anything that he might construe, rightly or wrongly, as endangering his family. So again, I am not proud of the story, but it is who I am. And as I've said before, one of the reasons I love being Jewish is that it makes me a better human being. At this point, I want to pivot to our next PowerPoint presentation, which has much more to do with contemporary issues that have been burning on the back burner for decades and decades and decades and centuries, and now have moved to the front burner. Protests, violence, and looting. Oh my. The obligation to protest individual behavior is right at the very heart of the Torah. Here you see the verses. The verse in red is the verse that obligates us to reprove your kinsman, but incur no guilt because of him. And you can see some very familiar verses on the before this verse and after this verse. If you take a look at the heart, you'll see that you can imagine this heart being three-dimensional rather than two-dimensional. How the ancient authors emphasized something was not by repeating it necessarily, or not by starting with it necessarily, but by building up to it. If you imagine a ziggurat, if you imagine an ancient temple, you go up different levels and then you get to the very highest point where the temple is, and then you go back down the other side. That's the way the Torah in general, but the book of Leviticus in particular is written. So you ascend the stairs of holiness until you get to chapter 19. And the middle of chapter 19 are these verses. And then after chapter 19, you go back down the ladder of holiness. You can see that so dramatically because we're talking about chapter 19 here. Both chapter 18 and chapter 20, which are on the second tier of holiness of this ziggurat, they both deal with exactly the same prohibitions, right? Which we'll be reading, or which many people will be reading on the mincha service of Rosh Hashanah, the sexual prohibitions. But what we see in the way that the Talmud took its inheritance of the demand to protest and the prophetic legacy of protesting injustice was as follows. We've got this in the name of 4 different rabbis: Rav, Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Yochanan, and Rav Chadiva taught. Anyone who can protest towards the member of his household, but does not protest, is liable for the members of his household. So let's go back. You see that verse? Reprove your kinsman, but incur no guilt because of him. So the way these rabbis are reading that verse is that if you don't reprove your kinsman, whatever transgression he is committing, you are complicit. You are complicit, and therefore you are guilty. And here, what the rabbis say is that you are liable for his punishment. But what they do is extend that, not just to members of the household, but to people of the town. He is liable for the people of his town. And here is really where you get the grandiose vision of the rabbis of the Talmud. Anyone who can protest towards the members of the whole world for the transgression that they're committing, but does not protest, he's liable for the transgressions of the whole world, right? The rabbis think that we are really, really powerful. The rabbis, I don't know, they're almost anti-Semitic in how powerful and influential they think they are. We're not that influential. We're not, relatively, disproportionately, but really, I mean, what can we do? What the rabbis here are saying is that it doesn't matter what you can do. It doesn't matter how effective you might be. But if you have the possibility, and here, when it says anyone who can protest, it doesn't mean that their protest is going to be effective necessarily. The word can is efshar. Anyone who has the possibility of protesting. So you can't say to yourself, what good is my little protest going to do? If you can protest without putting your life in danger, because that's already a separate category, then what the rabbis of our tradition are saying is that not only do we have an obligation, a mitzvah, to do that, but if we refrain, if we remain indifferent from protesting, then we are part of the problem and that we are liable for the punishment of that transgression. In terms of violence, Judaism is not a pacifist tradition. We avoid violence whenever we can. One of the most important values is the sanctity of life. But the Talmud, in this pithy little saying, says, he who's coming to kill you, wake up earlier and kill him first, right? There is no obligation to be killed. All right, so that's about self-defense. What about when your life is not in danger? What about violence in that case? So this is not about our life being in danger. This is about freedom. We talked about that last night. Freedom is an essential value, a prime value, a cardinal value of Judaism. And in the process of securing our freedom from Egypt, at the very beginning of our people's history, some eggs were broken. So you can call it collateral damage. That wasn't really the point. We wanted to instill a sense of fear and awe in the Egyptians. We wanted to get the Israelites out. But when you think about all the damage that was done during the 10 plagues, it makes you realize that the resort to violence is not something that is foreign to our people's history. And when I say our people, I mean both our people as Jews, as Israelites, and later as Jews, but also as Americans. When I lived in Boston, I actually got to go to the reconstructed boat where they dumped the tea. And it was thrilling to be in that place, to be on that ship in the harbor where our people, writ large, took a stand about liberty. That's right. Not everybody supported the Irgun when they bombed the British military headquarters. They didn't just bomb a hotel, they bombed the British military headquarters that was stationed in the basement of the King David Hotel. But 91 people died. Yes, they warned the British that they were planting the bombs, and they wanted them, I believe sincerely, that the Irgun wanted the Brits and the other people in the hotel to get out of the hotel. But the Irgun absolutely resorted to violence, and the British would certainly characterize it as terrorism in order to achieve their political goals, namely freedom and independence. But it wasn't just the Irgun. Even the general militia known as the Palmach. The Palmach was the young fighting group of the Haganah, the kind of precursor to the Israeli Defense Forces. They repeatedly bombed British radar stations that were being used to track illegal immigrant ships. They sabotaged British ships, as in sunk British ships, that were being used to deport our illegal immigrants, illegal from as a result of the White Paper of 1939, and they blew up bridges and railway lines. The Palmach performed a single assassination operation in which a British official who had been deemed excessively cruel to Jewish prisoners was summarily shot dead. That was different. No analogy is perfect. It was different. But it was also about freedom, survival, and dignity. When I say it was different, what am I talking about? I'm talking about that first slide. It was different than the racial justice protests, which have included some degree of violence and some degree of looting that we have seen in this country for decades and decades and decades, but most recently, since the murder of George Floyd and others. I am not condoning looting. I am not condoning looting, but our righteous indignation about looting should be tempered by our own history. Let me say that again. I am not condoning looting. I am condemning looting. But our righteous indignation about those who loot should be tempered by our own history. Take a look. When we left Egypt, we stripped or despoiled, depending on the translation, the Egyptians of their silver and gold. Most of the translations say that we asked for the silver and gold of our Egyptian neighbors as loans. That makes no sense, and it makes the Israelites look even worse. I think there's a better translation. But when the Egyptian soldiers and chariots followed us after Pharaoh's change of mind, the Midrash says that the ornamentation from the Egyptians' horses and chariots that washed ashore the Red Sea when the walls of the Red Sea came back together, the plunder was greater than what the Israelites had earlier taken from the Egyptians. So our tradition, right, that's Midrash, that's not in the Torah itself. Our tradition understands that there was a kind of righteousness to despoiling the Egyptians of their wealth. And there's lots of different explanations for this, but already in the rabbinic period, so close to 2,000 years ago, there's a recognition that the Egyptians owed us money for the time we spent working for them without compensation. In contemporary terms, reparations. And I will remind everybody that Israel had a debate, but ultimately decided to accept the reparations from Germany. And unto this day, we have legal battles about getting possessions of European Jews back to their rightful owners. We don't need to condone looting to empathize with the demands of the protesters for justice. We can be that nuanced. We can make that distinction. And we can avoid hypocrisy by having our own history and struggle and religious imperatives at the forefront of our minds. Let me go back to that very first slide about the obligation to protect, right? Do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. Then we have reprove your kinsman, but incur no guilt because of him. Finally, love your neighbor as yourself. And here, what I'm adding are some of the rabbinic understandings, okay? Do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor, even if you need to hire someone to save them. Once they're saved, you can ask for the money that you put out to be returned. If the person doesn't return it, you can sue them, and according to the law, you're entitled to that money. But at the moment when their life is in jeopardy, you have to do whatever is in your means to save that person. You shall surely rebuke, the Talmud says, even 100 times. Just because they don't listen the first 99 times doesn't exempt you from continuing to make the effort, even that 100th time. And finally, for love your neighbor as yourself, what the most hard-hitting interpretation of that is for me is that as much slack as you cut yourself sometimes, that's how much slack you need to cut your neighbor in order to judge them with benefit, in order to give them the benefit of the doubt. And then finally, these laws that keep appearing all over the Torah and are unique in the ancient Near Eastern legal codes are about having the same rules, the same laws for the residents and the resident aliens, and the prohibition of oppressing them because we were oppressed and we know exactly what it was like to be oppressed. And that should give us the empathy that is required to stand up for those people in our society who are being oppressed. And the final word from our Talmud. The sages said that due to the sins of the delay of justice, the distortion of justice, the perversion of justice, the miscarriage of justice, and then for neglect in the study of Torah, violence and looting abound in the world, and pestilence and famine come, and people eat and are not sated. It's hard not to read that piece of 2,000-year-old wisdom and not think about the world in general and the United States in particular at this moment. We have problems with our criminal justice system. We've had problems. We have protests for racial justice, just at the same time as we have a pandemic that is exposing these rifts and these problems in our society. Finishing up with a piece of Talmud that is not written by a Reform or a Reconstructionist or a conservative or even a modern Orthodox rabbi. It's written by the Talmud. The entire Torah was given for the sake of peace. And then they cite this verse from Proverbs, we say that in the Torah service, but we're referring okay, let me translate it. Her ways are ways to pleasantness and all her paths to peace. We're saying that not about what the book of Proverbs is referring to, which is wisdom, right? Wisdom's ways are pleasant and wisdom's paths are peaceful. We're saying that about the Torah. The rabbis are telling us that we need to read and to apply the Torah so that all of her ways lead to pleasantness, which is how they understand that verse, and that all her paths lead to peace. That's why they're using this text as proof that the entire Torah was given for the sake of peace. We now have our assignment. We know how the rabbis want us to read the Torah, and not just to read the Torah, but to act on the Torah in order to bring pleasantness and to bring peace. Shana Tova.